The Cuban Missile Crisis. Post-World War II started off with the Germans invading Poland in September of 1939. Then, the Axis power, or the enemies, surrendered. This side consisted of Italy, Japan, and Germany. The other side was the Allies, and they consisted of France, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. Both Italy and Germany surrendered, but Japan stayed. The reason Japan surrendered shortly after was because the United States dropped a bomb on Japan, leaving them to do nothing else but surrender. After the Soviets asked the United States to start a second front to the war, which the United States did, but they waited longer than necessary so that they would be weakened by Germany. This led the Soviets distrusting the United States, leading into the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1949 was the start of the arms race. The Soviet Union had created their first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949. The world was shocked that they had made such a massive weapon because everyone thought they were behind in their nuclear development. A few years go by, and in 1952, the United States detonate their first hydrogen bomb. This was an even more powerful version of the nuclear bomb. The Soviets were not pleased with the Americans making such a deadly weapon. So 1 year later, in 1953, the Soviet Union detonated their first hydrogen bomb. Both countries started to make ICBMs, which are deadly missiles that can launch from as far away as 3,500 miles. Both countries thought they were going to war due to all the nuclear developments, so they started making missiles that would destroy enemy ICBMs.
President Eisenhower once said, "You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is that it will go over very quickly." This is how he came up with the domino effect, when the Soviets started to believe in communism, and it kept on flowing to other countries quickly. But the domino effect stopped because the US was against it. On March 12, 1947, President Truman gave a speech addressing the Truman Doctrine. The cause for this speech was because the British government made announcements stating that they would no longer provide military or economic assistance to the Greeks because they were fighting a civil war against Greek communists. But Truman wanted to support the Greek government in taking down the communists. He also gave assistance to Turkey, who heavily depended on British aid. Truman decided to give both governments $400 million worth of aid and military equipment.
Cuba grew dependent on the Soviet Union for military and economic aid. The United States and the Soviet Union were currently in the Cold War, which lasted from 1945 to 1991. A pilot of an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba on October 14, 1962, and photographed a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled for installation. The plane was seen in a launch site in San Cristobal, Cuba. The spy plane also photographed a nuclear warhead bunker under construction in San Cristobal, Cuba. This was the start of the many missile threats that occurred during this event. President Kennedy was not notified about the situation until 2 days later on October 16th and immediately called together the executive committee. The urgency of the situation grew from the fact that the missiles were only 90 miles south of Florida.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gambled on sending the missiles to Cuba. The United States and Cuba already had a hostile relationship with each other after the Kennedy administration had launched an attack on the island, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. in 1961. Castro and Khrushchev saw the missiles as a means of deterring further U.S. aggression. The United States did not like the missiles that were in Cuba and saw them as a threat to the U.S. They were thinking of ways to stop the missiles instead of starting a nuclear war. Nearly 1 week went past, and they came up with a variety of options. One of the leading options was a bombing attack on the missile site in Cuba and a full-scale invasion on Cuba. Kennedy decided to ditch that decision and go to a more measurable approach. He would first employ the Navy to blockade or quarantine Cuba to make sure no more missiles were sent to Cuba. On October 24th, the Soviets brought ships which neared the line of the U.S. vessels, enforcing the blockade. If the ships attempted to breach the blockades, there might have been a military confrontation which could have caused a nuclear exchange. Although there were no confrontations between the ships in the blockade, the two superpowers were not making any moves until about a week after the blockade incident, when a U.S. plane was shot down while flying over Cuba on October 27th. There were then soldiers ready to fight in Florida in case the Soviets tried to make an attack on the U.S. The man who was in the plane was a 35-year-old pilot named Major Rudolph Anderson, who is now considered the sole U.S. combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. Secretary of Defenseman named Robert McNamara was quoted saying, "I thought it was the last Saturday I would ever see." At this point, there was a lot of tension between the powers. They had been exchanging letters and other communications. A day earlier, on October 26th, Khrushchev sent a letter to Kennedy stating that he would remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a promise that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Then, the following day, on October 27th, the Soviet leader sent a second letter stating that if the U.S. dismantles its missiles in Turkey, then the Soviets would dismantle theirs in Cuba. Kennedy, along with many others, decided to accept the terms of the first letter, but denied the second letter entirely. Secretly, American officials decided to withdraw the missiles in Turkey soon after General Robert Kennedy sent the letter to the Soviet ambassador in Washington. On October 28th, the crisis was beginning to close. Both powers were solemn by the event and made a direct hotline from Washington to Moscow to prevent further situations or threats in the future. After the missiles were dismantled, the launch sites were no longer in construction, and there was no longer a place to assemble the heavy-duty missiles. The Soviets brought their missiles back home on big cargo ships, and Cuba was left on their own. This event was one of the greatest achievements in the Kennedy administration. The tension between the two powers were still a bit shaky, but they had a sigh of relief that they hadn't started a nuclear war that could have meant world demolition.